Hi, my name is Rihanna Yaman, and I will be presenting on the settlement for the 60 scoop, the resurface. What is a 60 scoop? Well, in the late 1950s to 1980s, many Indigenous children were stripped away from their families and put into foster care, where they were adopted by non-Aboriginal families. Through these actions, the Canadian government was able to help take Indigenous culture away from these children. Consequently, many children suffered from different types of abuse, namely physical, emotional, and sexual abuse from their adoptive parents and in foster care. As a result of the suffering many Indigenous children faced during this time, the Canadian government offered their community a settlement of 875 million Canadian dollars to the survivors of the 60 scoop in hopes of reconciliation. Thesis: the settlement of the 60 Scoop and the Indian Act occurred as a result of the misuse of treaties and lack of equality between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples. In terms of historical context, Canadians gained land through displacing and assimilating the Indigenous people. This stage occurred through the suppressing of Indigenous peoples' languages and cultures by the Canadian government. The 60 Scoop was made possible through the creation of new laws such as the Indian Act and Section 35 in the Constitution, both of which allow the Canadian government to govern almost all aspects of Indigenous peoples' lives. This control allows for the government to restrict and ban many of their cultural ceremonies, such as a potluck ceremony, and allows the government to take away their right to self-governance. The legal relationship between the Indigenous people of Canada and the Canadian government during the 60s scoop came in three forms: criminal justice, social welfare, and resource development. The criminal justice form occurred when the government began making new laws that permitted taking Indigenous children away from their families. While the resources and social well-being forms occurred when the social welfare and well-being of children in foster care had a downfall in terms of diseases and different types of abuse such as physical and sexual. This then led to a myriad of psychological disorders that resulted in their imprisonment and lack of employment and education, which impacted the Indigenous survivors and the generations to follow. This is because many of the orphanages did not have enough government resources to protect children from these issues. As a result, many Indigenous people died from lack of hygiene, and suicide became very common for those surviving. Culture and traditions are embedded in land. By having their land stripped away from them, Indigenous communities were also stripped away of their culture and tradition. By taking away their land, the meaning of it changed. This is because their land was being used to build orphanages and now is used for reserves instead of being used to perform rituals and hunt. Furthermore, Indigenous peoples no longer own their land, but instead their land belongs to the Crown. Therefore, the role of Indigenous peoples changed in that they are now restricted in terms of what they can do on their land and the jobs they can take. Furthermore, the role of women has changed even more of that of men. As stated in the Indian Act, women are no longer allowed to have an ongoing role in their community, which is still a topic of debate today. According to the Law Dictionary, reconciliation is the restoration of peaceful or amicable relations between two individuals who were previously in conflict with one another. The Indigenous community as well as the Euro-Canadians are on the path of reconciliation. This is evident through the efforts the government is trying to make by adjusting existing laws that discriminate Indigenous peoples, as well as by giving them their right of self-governance back. The settlement has come to a halt as there have been issues regarding the legal fees that the government has to pay on behalf of Indigenous survivors. The judge on the case has stated that 75 million Canadian dollars in legal fee is an unreasonable amount of money, and until this issue has been resolved, the settlement cannot continue. However, the Canadian government is still willing to pay the 875 million Canadian dollars in damages once legal fees have been settled. Since the downfall of the relationship between Indigenous communities and Canadians, the settlement is one of the first steps to a full reconciliation where Indigenous peoples and Canadian citizens can coexist in society. However, the reconciliation process has a long way to go to undo the damage that has been done to Indigenous communities. Thank you.